I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Holly Johnson and her talk entitled Addressing Gender-Based Violence Through Accurate Measurement. Dr. Johnson has been engaged in research on violence against women for over 30 years, first at StatsCan and more recently as professor of criminology at the University of Ottawa. Her research interests center on primary prevention, improving societal responses to crimes of violence against women, and improving research methodologies for measuring women's experiences of violence. Dr. Johnson has served on numerous international initiatives, including the International Violence Against Women Survey, the Secretary General's Report on Violence Against Women, the UN Economic Commission for Europe's Task Force on Violence Against Women Surveys, and the UN Expert Group on Indicators on Violence Against Women. Most recently, she worked with the UN Statistical Division to draft guidelines to assist countries in the implementation of statistical surveys on violence against women. She's currently a member of the International Evaluation Advisory Group for UN Women's Safe Cities Free of Violence Against Women and Girls Global Program. So please help me welcome Dr. Holly Johnson.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for being here till the bitter end in this very hot and sleepy room. Or maybe you're just waiting for the spoken word, and that's great too. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank Western University for very generously supporting my participation in this survey, or in this workshop conference. And what I've been asked to reflect on is my retrospective on StatsCan's evolution of methods to measure violence against women. I guess due to my participation both inside and now outside of Statistics Canada. So random sample surveys are essential for measuring prevalence in the population, and StatsCan is the agency that does this in the largest way. They conduct national surveys and have a lot of influence on policy. So I think it's very important that we participate in and be active critics of the way that they measure violence against women and try to improve it as we go along. So in a way, this is a story of the successes and the struggles of feminists to ensure that women's experiences are accurately portrayed in these surveys that inform government policy. So I'm going to begin by celebrating the growth of feminist-inspired research tools for measuring women's experiences, then trace the return to more traditional tools, and finally to a more hopeful place we find ourselves today, which is at the Gender-Based Violence Survey, which has been foreshadowed by Greta this morning, this afternoon. I can't remember when. So I'm going to begin with a quote from Sylvia Walby, who's a British researcher who spends a great deal of her time and energy thinking about the power of measurement. And she says, "Measurement replicates and entrenches existing forms of power, or measurement enables popular myths to be challenged by science. When women are sufficiently present in science to challenge dominant knowledge, science is less patriarchal than popular myths." And there's no doubt that science and the scientific method are altered when women take central roles in the production of knowledge claims. And by including women directly, feminists have not only transformed traditional research tools, but they've made visible social and economic inequalities in the domains of work, health, family, and others that were previously obscured. And challenging dominant truth claims surrounding women's experience of male violence is one area where feminist researchers have made important gains. We provided robust evidence to refute widespread assumptions about rape, sexual harassment, and intimate partner violence, that they are rare and committed by a few easily identifiable and obviously dangerous men. However, in today's context, where formal equality is perceived to have been achieved, gendered material inequalities are easily obscured, and feminist-inspired research tools and the knowledge they produce are met with stiff resistance. Situating statistical data within larger social and political contexts has never been easy. And it's at the basis of current feminist struggles to retain a gendered focus on women's experiences. So the evolution of the measurement of women's experiences of violence has progressed along three tracks. The first has been inclusion of a few targeted surveys on addressing women's experiences on crime victimization or women's health, so a few questions on a much larger survey, the broader context. The second is dedicated surveys focusing exclusively on violence against women, using specialized methodologies influenced by a feminist framework. And the third is measuring intimate partner violence as a form of family conflict, using something called the conflict tactic scale. So these different approaches produce wildly different estimates, and each helps to portray or conceal the gendered nature of male violence against women. So first, let's start at these generic crime victimization surveys that I'm most familiar with. So back in the 1970s, governments began to launch these surveys, which are random surveys of the population designed to estimate the incidence of crime victimization among the population, recognizing that police statistics are an incomplete counting. So they were designed to produce estimates of a wide range of crimes, property, and violent crimes, and they weren't specifically designed to measure women's experiences of male violence, and no precautions were taken to ensure that these experiences were measured accurately or women could participate safely. And the androcentric research establishment had little knowledge or sensitivity of gender inequality or of male violence against women. And predictably, these surveys included very few questions. They used wording such as rape, which we now know discourages disclosures of sexual violence. They use very general questions about physical violence and did not probe specifically about partners. And predictably, women were reluctant to disclose their experiences based on these very crude questions and the fact that interviewers weren't trained to be sensitive towards the questions that they were asking. So the results portrayed rape and partner violence as relatively rare. And this was consistent with dominant understandings, and it was accepted uncritically, at least by policymakers and by the survey designers. The women reported high rates of fear and low rates of violence on these surveys. And it was interpreted by influential male criminologists as reflecting, and I quote, concerns of a symbolic nature or an emotive nature rather than concrete possibilities. In other words, women are understandably concerned about rape because the consequences can be traumatic. But in reality, the risk of falling victim to rape was so rare. The concerns about rape, therefore, were symbolic and not real. And in addition, women reported high levels of self-protection on these surveys. They took all kinds of measures to protect themselves against the threat of violence. And this was used to support the need for women-focused prevention strategies. So it followed then that women need to be reassured that the risk of violence was low, despite their fears, and encouraged to keep policing themselves and protecting themselves by monitoring their behavior and taking precautions. So fear became the problem, not violence. And the public policy priority in the 1980s, early 90s, was one of fear reduction rather than violence reduction. We just have to convince women that the risk is low, but keep on protecting yourself. We don't have a problem with violence. So this depiction of male violence, of course, was grossly out of line with what shelters, women's advocates were witnessing in shelters and rape crisis centers. And these advocates, along with feminist researchers, were alarmed at the power of government agencies to so drastically misrepresent women's realities. So two feminist pioneers got to work to inject feminist and women-centered principles into survey techniques. You probably heard of them. One was Diana Russell, the other was Mary Koss. Diana Russell in her study of rape in San Francisco, and Mary Koss in her studies of sexual violence among college and university students. So Diana Russell's work in the 80s was groundbreaking and ahead of her time in the way she framed her questions and the way she trained her interviewers, female interviewers. And these features were not incorporated into government surveys until many years later. I think we at Statistics Canada were the first to do it with the Violence Against Women survey. And she came out with estimates of rape that were 7 times higher for her city, San Francisco, than a government survey. Mary Koss, in her work on sexual violence, conceptualized it along a continuum, which reflecting a growing feminist consciousness about the interconnections among women's experience of coerced and unwanted and forced sexual acts. This method has been used on campuses, hundreds of campuses across the United States over the years, and consistently shows that 1/4 of female students have experienced rape or attempted rape, a rate that's 10 to 15 times higher than the government surveys in the United States. So thus began the second track in the evolution of documenting the breadth of male violence against women, and that's the dedicated surveys focusing specifically on violence with a feminist orientation. So the influence of these early feminist researchers was far-reaching. Under growing pressure, the United States government redesigned their national survey, and although it's still flawed, rates of sexual violence jumped 3 to 4 times. The British government did the same with similar results. The Canadian government went one step further, and in 1993, we implemented a large national survey on violence against women exclusively. And the survey was groundbreaking and unique in many respects. It incorporated a continuum of violence that included sexual harassment. It approached partner violence as a course of conduct grounded within non-physical, non-criminal acts of coercive control. Women were asked to report on their experiences of violence over a lifetime to capture fuller histories of assaults and threats, harassment, and to document the repetitive ongoing nature of much violence. And what made it especially unique was the extensive input from frontline service providers and advocates, women in shelters and crisis centers across the country who assisted with question wording, interviewer training, and safety features to protect the women responding. These ethical requirements have now been codified by the World Health Organization into guidelines for doing this work decades after Diana Russell recognized their importance. And these types of dedicated violence against women surveys have been conducted in numerous countries around the world and are promoted by the UN as essential for policymaking. The results of this survey in the early 90s brought sharp focus and attention to violence against women in Canada. Overall, half reported at least one incident of violence in their lifetime, which at the time shocked everyone except those working on the front lines. So over a relatively short period of time, feminist-inspired innovations to survey methods had begun to exert an influence on the way governments, international agencies, and researchers were producing knowledge about male violence against women. This reflects a growing recognition at the time that women's experiences matter, that they are gendered, and that women's own accounts produce knowledge that is more complete. The result is a more accurate depiction on the one hand and a highly contested terrain on the other. So soon afterwards, feminist researchers became the targets of vicious attacks from those with no direct knowledge or experience working with social science research, supported by a media growing increasingly hostile to feminist claims and gains. Date rape suddenly went from an important social issue to rape hype. Women were accused of making false claims after consensual sex they later regretted, or taking revenge on hapless men. Feminism was accused of ingraining a victim culture in women, where they were duped into conflating minor, inconsequential acts with truly serious, real rape. As neoliberalism declares war on equality, we apparently all have free choice, and therefore all responsible for making the right choices to reduce our risk of danger. Women who are violated have simply made bad choices. What helped to stoke this backlash was the rapid growth of the family conflict approach, the third track. You've heard about the conflict tactics scale. It purports to measure how couples resolve conflicts, ranging from verbal reasoning and arguments to physical acts of aggression. It finds that men and women are equally likely to use violent tactics to solve conflicts, based on a very basic counting system that equates an ineffective push in self-defense with a push down the stairs that results in hospitalization and is intended to terrorize. Findings of gender parity help to stroke the anti-feminist agenda, even though it obviously ignores the vast gender differences in the use of violence in any other domain, and somehow manages to sidestep extensive and unambiguous evidence that male violence lands women in hospitals and emergency shelters, and sometimes results in death. Well, we might question the relevance of a method that was originally developed 40 years ago, particularly as, and here I quote a former CTS researcher, if you had a screening test that consistently gave a different result than all of the other tests for a medical condition, you would question the test, not the condition. She rightly calls it a scandal that we are a little better at measuring domestic violence today than in the 1970s. Now, a modified version of the CTS had been adapted by us at StatsCan for the 1993 survey. Because it asks numerous behaviorally specific questions about a range of acts, it was considered superior to previous methods of asking one or two questions that yielded low prevalence. Asking women to disclose a wide range of threats and physical and sexual assaults, and by the way, we incorporated sexual assaults. It wasn't on the CTS at the time because, well, you don't resolve conflicts through sexual violence. And over their lifetime yielded a rate of 30% of women who were victims of wife assault, not counting dates and boyfriends. But when it's applied to both men and women, and by the way, when it's applied to both men and women, these are not men and women in couples. These are randomly selected women and randomly selected men. And when it's applied with a narrow focus on the previous year or few years and stripped of important details, with no possibility of knowing whether these acts are committed in self-defense, and with frequency, severity, and escalation at other contexts, such as coercive control, is removed, this is where the problem begins. Over the years since the 1993 survey, StatsCan has reverted back to the method they had rejected for good methodological reasons. Partner violence is again measured through questions added to a generic crime victimization survey, but they're asked to both men and women. So the CTS has been used for the past 20 years, despite criticisms that it presents a distorted picture of intimate partner violence. It oversimplifies this violence and ignores context and the cumulative effects of threats, assaults, and coercive control. As a result, it fails to capture gender-specific types of intimate partner violence. And even though StatsCan publications show large differences in the impacts and the consequences and the severity of violence suffered by women as compared to men, this context is easily removed by those who aim to portray the violence as gender symmetrical. These details are important because with more sophisticated analysis that StatsCan does, a postdoc, for example, who was in StatsCan for a year, named Donna S. Serra, produced a very important piece of work using sophisticated statistical analysis that shows that serious, repetitive, fear-inducing, liberty-restricted violence is inflicted uniquely by men against women and not the reverse. So the challenge for feminist researchers is to develop the methods to back up the assertion that violence against women is the cornerstone of women's inequality. The violence against women not only springs from women's inequality, but holds the rest of women's oppressions in place and vice versa. Linking male violence and gender equality requires more complex and detailed documentation of the short and long-term consequences of violence than has been the practice. Consequences that extend beyond physical and emotional injury and include poverty, homelessness, losing jobs, losing custody of children to the state or to violent partners, threats of deportation, or losing support from religious or cultural communities. The interlocking nature of male violence and systemic gender inequalities is the undocumented backdrop to a decontextualized counting of individual acts where life-threatening assaults and coercive control are counted as equal to a push in self-defense. The second challenge, related but separate from this, is that men and women are identified in survey research up to this point by their sex, male, female, and socially constructed gender disappears. In essence, sex is conflated with gender, with no consideration for the social roles, the status, or power that are ascribed to male and female gender. And when gendered realities are rendered invisible and prevailing discourses tell us we're all equal now, as Stephen Harper's first minister responsible for the status of women, named Bev Oda, famously said, we're all equal now, then gender inequality is strengthened. So what are the implications of this Resistance to acknowledging pervasive male violence and the centrality of gender in men's violence and control over women is fierce and has profound implications that are likely obvious to you. So anti-feminist and men's rights groups are given legitimacy. It's easy to deny that patriarchal power structures have anything to do with violence. The media and the public are misled. Women's complaints about violence are easily dismissed. Feminists are painted as marginal and extreme and a threat to the social order, and resources are shifted away from services for women. If men and women are equally violent in intimate relationships, claims about gender inequality lose their legitimacy. So where are we now? The good news is that under the federal, as we heard earlier, under the federal government's gender-based violence strategy, Status Women Canada is funding Statistics Canada to conduct a large national survey dedicated to measuring experiences of violence. The sample is very large, which allows us to drill down to geographic locations, to very small populations. It's in the field now, and it is available online. It is, if you just Google Survey of Safety in Public and Private Spaces, it should come up with a full questionnaire. Not in a PDF format, but it's HTML, I guess. They've made some important additions, I think. It's a possibility to complete it online, and it's not possible for any one of us to just go and find it and complete it online. You have to be, it's a randomly selected population sample. So if you're lucky enough to get invited to participate, you can choose to do it online or telephone interviews. And importantly, they now have a method for including cell phones, because so many people now are opting for, especially young people, opting for cell phones only. And it's going into the territories, and it will be in-person option in the territories. So a very big, large, and very important undertaking. And it's a radical departure, I think, from the surveys that they have been sticking with over the last 20 years or 25 years that have really used outdated tools. So it's a big step forward in terms of including things like attitudes and norms. The idea is this survey will be repeated, but who knows if we have a different government down the road, whether it will or not. But the idea is to track attitudes and norms over time. So are we actually altering attitudes and norms that contribute to a climate where violence against women is okay? Sexual harassment in public and places and in the workplace, technology-facilitated violence, which is critical, because young people especially living online and have some pretty horrific experiences of this. I'm going to go into each of these to show you exactly what the questions are, so you have an idea. And partner violence has been reframed, and it's thanks to some women who have been working on testing a new method for measuring partner violence for some time, two of whom come from Western, Marilyn Ford-Guilbeault and Nadine Wathen. And so they work very, very hard to convince Statistics Canada that no, it's not a good idea to keep repeating the same method just because you don't want to break a trend. There's improved measures of economic distress, improved measures of consequences like PTSD, suicidal thoughts, and homelessness as a result of partner violence. What's not new is that they're continuing to measure sexual assault. The questions are not bad, but they could have elaborated, I think. These are taken, the first two are taken from the Violence Against Women survey in '93. As I say, they don't like to break a trend. So sexual acts through force or the use of force and unwanted sexual touching. And a few years ago on their victimization survey, they added this one. And unfortunately, for those of us who are interested in looking at drug and alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, we can't separate that from other forms of non-physical force, like simply power differentials. Okay, so to give you an idea, what we can't do from this is to link attitudes and norms to perpetration, because it's a victimization survey. So it's really useful for understanding how the Canadian public carries around norms that are transphobic, that are homophobic, or that are rape myths. So, or gender equality. Here's one that focuses on rape myths, that women always lie about rape. Here's one that excuses partner violence or justifies it. There's another one that justifies partner violence, one that's transphobic, legitimizes the kind of controlling behaviors and discrimination against same-sex couples. So it's not everything, but it's something. And the problem with working with a lot of attitudinal questions like rape myths is that there's a lot of social desirability. People generally know what they're supposed to answer. So it's a tricky one. So this is a mixture of things that will give us something in terms of norms. Inappropriate behavior in public space in the last year. So we have some sexual harassment, physical contact, indecent exposure. We have unwanted comments, so the sexual harassment towards somebody who may appear to be gay or lesbian or transsexual, unwanted comments, and that's the kind of thing women get on the street all the time, and that same kind of thing. Inappropriate behavior in the workplace. So there's inappropriate sexual jokes, sexual attention, unwanted contact, again, suggestions or ridicule towards gay or lesbian or trans people, or being treated differently because of sexual orientation or what people assume is your sexual orientation, and the same with transgender. So again, not everything, but it's the first time we will have to be able to link. I think what's important too is to be able to link all these different experiences together, because women experience many, many different forms of violence, and it's important to see what combinations of things we experience. Online, receiving threats to you individually, receiving threats or aggressive comments through group emails. There's quite a few on related to intimate sexually explicit images or videos. So this is someone posted or distributed or threatened. We have someone pressured you to send, someone sent you when you did not want them to. Okay, so partner violence. This collaboration of feminist researchers tested something called, I forgot now, I'll have to tell you later. Marilyn Ford Gilbo and her team tested and came out with a suggestion for 15 or 16 items. And StatsCan, I think, has 25 or 27. So what you will notice is that it starts out, and this is the order for intimate partners, so it could be a former spouse, a current spouse, common law, married, dating partners. And I think that's an important improvement. The first several are about the kinds of autonomy limiting, jealous behaviors, isolation, psychological abuse, put downs, etc. And I suspect that's for a more gentle lead-in to talking about violence. Again, I mean, there are five slides of these, so I'll go through them fairly quickly. Told you you're crazy or stupid, convince your children and family you're crazy or stupid, stalking, prevented you from seeing your family and friends. And then we get into a mix of the kinds of psychologically abusive and isolating behaviors and sexual assault and physical assault. So quite specific, behaviorally specific questions about forced sex, about being shaken, pushed, grabbed, or thrown, and then back to something as isolating, hit with a fist, confinement, forced sex, threaten to harm or kill someone else, so I guess the psychological abuse, physical abuse, physical threat, threatened, and then I guess the psychological abuse again. So the idea here is that these questions will be used together. In past StatsCan surveys, there are questions about, far fewer of them, of psychological abuse, separate from physical and sexual abuse. And so it was the rare time, StatsCan never put those together. They would use the psychological abuse as a correlate or a predictor that shows that raised the risk of violence, but it was never sort of looked at in terms of a constellation of things. And so it really depends, I'm a skeptic, but it depends how they do the analysis. If they can do the analysis where these things are examined together or some typologies come out of them, then the hope and the wish and the intention is that it will show the gendered nature better. Okay, so here are the women responsible for really pushing this forward. Marilyn Nadine from Western, Kelly Stotts-Corey from UNB, Sue O'Donnell, UNB, Colleen Varco from UBC, Harry McMillan, McMaster, and Nancy Perrin from Johns Hopkins. So some of those names I'm sure are familiar to you. So big thanks to them for making that happen. Again, better information, more extensive on the consequences in terms of being afraid and controlled and trapped, and I think there's going to be real gender difference there. We've also had questions about being afraid, and that had a big gender difference. Feeling anxious, physical injuries have always been there, but now we have loss of consciousness. Homelessness is an outcome, having lived in a shelter or on the street or somewhere else, and PTSD symptoms. And there are others as well, but these are just the highlights. There are new questions about harsh parenting and new questions about child physical and sexual abuse. Now, the physical and sexual abuse were actually on the 2014 victimization survey and show a very strong correlation with adult victimization. So women who are sexually abused in childhood have much higher rates of sexual abuse in adulthood. So it took years and years to get those on there. And they're the child abuse by parents and caregivers. Okay, so just to conclude then, I think early feminist and influenced social science surveys helped to establish male violence against women as a major concern, requiring government action. And the growing use of gender-neutral research tools over the years reversed this progress by obscuring inequalities and the structural and cultural supports for gendered violence. So we're now at a more hopeful place, I think. It depends not on how StatsCan analyzes the data, but how they release the data file. In the past, they have made it excruciatingly difficult to get at the raw data, and people like Greta desperately need it. I mean, it's the sophisticated kinds of analysis that she described that are really going to move this forward, rather than just crosstabs and frequencies and, this by male and female. We have to move on from there. So it depends how far the data are shared with researchers. It's a continuing challenge that we have to make sure that social science research and data doesn't further disadvantage women, and that we continue to try to substantiate the links between gendered inequalities and violence in a way that's going to point to the need for structural and not individual change. And it's essential for reinstating male violence as a gender equality issue and keeping it on the map. So thank you. Thank you again for being here.
So we have time for a couple quick questions. Anyone?
Yes. So in the surveys, do you feel it's better for questions to be as detailed as possible to give the participant as much information regarding what you're trying to measure, or is it better to have them shorter so that person has their own can use their own interpretation?
No, it's the former. It's better than the latter. Okay. So it's better to provide more opportunities for someone to see their experiences. So we never say anymore, have you ever been a victim of violence? Have you been a victim of assault? Has your partner assaulted you? What does assault mean? And so we use these very specific, behaviorally specific questions, and we ask them in multiple ways. And so, I've listened in on surveys, when you hear maybe recorded for quality purposes. It's after a few questions often that the respondent will say, yeah, I have. Because they want to hear, I think, a few before, what are you getting at here? And they might, I heard a woman say when you asked about forced sexual assault, she says, you're asking me if I've been raped. And the interviewer read the question again, and she said yes. And so, it's these questions too. I mean, they've been tested and tested. Nadine and Marilyn and their gang and they tested them with men, which is really important because men will be interviewed about these. And so there were some missing. For example, the one about. The wrong way around. For example, make comments about your sexual past or your sexual performance. That comes out much strongly for men, women ridiculing men for sexual performance. And so it was important that we captured male experiences that were not well measured on previous scales. And so it's not only to measure women's experiences better, but to measure the gendered nature of these experiences.
Sorry.
Oh, is there anyone else?
I don't
Go ahead.
see anyone. Is that a question? No.
Okay.
Yeah?
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
Did you want to follow up? Yeah, we're running really low on time, so I want to make sure we have enough time for the spoken word performances. To wrap it up.
Oh, thank you for your presentation. I'm glad there's a question about sexual orientation on there. I think that's key. I mean, I know there's so many questions that you can have, as many questions as maybe would be fruitful. But one thing that I'm thinking of is for those individuals who either identify as bisexual or who are engaged in different bisexual activities and relationships, how that can be a factor and not just revealing their sexual orientation, but being made fun of, humiliated, or like that as an aspect, because different research has shown that bisexual individuals, particularly women who identify as bisexual, have higher rates of physical and sexual violence. And so how perhaps can their experiences be captured in a way through this research, or can in some ways be obscured through just one question like that in terms of revealed or threatened to reveal your sexual orientation?
Well, there is a question, are you homosexual, heterosexual, or bisexual? And then you could look at that in combination, say, with this question and the ones about the harassment in public and private places as well. Yeah.
So one more question.
We do actually have to move on, but maybe you could talk to Dr. Johnson
I'm happy
afterwards.
to talk to you.
We're about 15 minutes past time, so 20 minutes past time. So thank you again, Dr. Johnson.